Hey adventurers, so today is going to be another book review. This is going to be for Sons of the Oak by David Farland. This is the 5th book in the Runelords series and is kind of a bridge book between the first arc and the second arc, and I'll talk more about that in a second here. This is a series that at this point in time, and I'm filming this in September, but I've already completed the entire series. So this, I'm just kind of catching up on reviews now. And Sons of the Oak is probably my favorite of the series. I meant to mention this. I read this series with Nico from Nico's book reviews, and we had a great time, lots of great discussion. We roped a couple other people into reading the series as well, or convinced other people to read the series, I guess. I don't think any of them are all the way through the books yet. The conversation has continued as we have continued reading, or as other people have continued reading these books. Before I get into the main body of my review though, I'd just quickly like to say if you're liking what you're seeing from an Erudite adventure, we'd really appreciate it if you'd like, comment, and subscribe. So Sons of the Oak, it's a fantasy, it's a high fantasy, very much an epic fantasy at the same time, and there's a lot of elemental fantasy elements to it. Elemental fantasy meaning fire, water, earth, and air, and probably lightning. A lot of people consider it to be elemental, but a lot of people say that's part of fire element, who knows. It's elemental fantasy. Actually this one is primarily dealing with fire magic, and I'll talk about that in a second here, more about that. So Sons of the Oak, as I already mentioned, it's book 5 in the Runelords by David Farland, and is in many ways a bridge book, meaning it takes place several years after the events of the first arc, as well as several years before the events of the second arc. But then it sets up for the events of the second arc. It wraps up some of the things that were going on in that first half, and is now bridging the gap between that first half and the second half, while explaining how we got into the second arc. There are some returning characters, but it also brings in our new characters in order to set up for books 6 through 9, or 6 through 8 since book 9 hasn't been released. But it's a bridge book in that it bridges the gap between those first 2 arcs and introduces and sets up our main characters that are going to be in the second half. Usually I save this type of thing for the end, but I do believe that this is my favorite book in the series. Not that other books in the series were bad, just that this one is my favorite of the series. It tells a very different story from previous books and is really about a family trying to flee and survive. The first half is about these characters running from their homes in order to make it to safety, and then the second half is about their new life and trying to fight for their new life and survive, or continue their fight for survival, I guess I could say. There's a ton that has changed since the events of book 4, since the final events of book 4 to now. I don't remember. I want to say it's about 8 years, 8 to 10 years, something like that, between book 4 and the beginning of book 5, something like that. So lots of things have happened in that time. The world has changed, the politics of the world have changed to some degree as well, because of the events that were happening in that first arc, with the saving the world from the threat of the Reavers and all that kind of stuff, with the new Earth King being brought in. All of those events that have happened have had an effect on the world, and we're seeing how much has changed at this point. We've gotten to explore the Grax a little bit, the Grax being the winged reptilian creatures. They are essentially the dragons in this fantasy world, but they're very different from dragons. They don't breathe fire. They're more actually like a wyvern or a wyvern, depending on how you pronounce it. And they're a non-fire breathing winged reptile, essentially. So we did get to see a little bit about them. I think it was in book 2, but we haven't really seen much about them since then. But book 5, we do get to explore a little bit about these creatures, and we get to spend some time with them. And I like dragons, so it's good to spend some time with them. We're also introduced to some new nightmarish monsters that are disturbing. I'll get to this in a second here, so I'll stop at that and just continue going through my outline here. We get to see a bit more of the darkness of this world. I mentioned it before, but Farland writes in such a way that he doesn't explicitly show the darkness. It's not a grim dark book, but that darkness is there, and it doesn't take much searching to find it. But it's done in such a way that you see it more because you're filling in the blanks in your own mind than because it's actually written into the book. And though we follow younger characters, this is far from a middle grade or young adult series. This is very much adult fantasy. It just happens to this book happens to follow younger characters. As always, Farland is asking the reader to consider whether or not it is good or right or ethical to use the magic of this world. He begins to explore the magic of the Flame Weavers a bit more in this book. In previous books, we've only really ever seen evil Flame Weavers, so we are forced to ask, as the characters are, whether or not fire magic can be used for good, or if it only corrupts. But we also see the power of it. We are shown that while fire magic and fire is heat and destruction and dangerous, we also see that it's light and warmth, and that juxtaposition is at the heart of this conversation in this series of the first 4 books really delve into the topic of the endowments and the ethicality of using endowments, taking somebody's strength, taking somebody's health, and giving it to yourself, and what does that mean? That conversation's still there, but not at the forefront. At the forefront of this book is the conversation about fire magic, and should you use it when you could lose yourself to this magic, and how does that affect the characters? The other story that begins here, though it certainly doesn't end here, is the question of how Farland will respond as his loved ones continued to be stripped away from him one by one. That is at the crux of this story, and though it seems like it's happening a lot in this book, this is really only the beginning of that story. We're also introduced to one of the characters that returns in this book is Waggett, and it's really good to see where he's at in this book. He's in a different place than before, but I don't know, it just makes me happy to see. He was one of my favorite side characters that was introduced in the first books. Or in the first arc. But we also are introduced to a new character named Humphrey in this book, and probably one of my favorite side characters ever. Just a great addition to the story. As I was reading this book, though it's a very different story, I was reminded a lot of the Wingfeather Saga by Andrew Peterson, which is another series I really enjoyed. I mentioned it, it's a very different story than this book, but there's a lot of similarities to it in, for one, it follows kids without being super YA or middle grade, but there's a level of depth, a level of complexity to the story, as well as some story beats and story elements that are similar to the 2 series. And noticing those similarities also helped me to enjoy this book more because I liked Wingfeather Saga. So like I already mentioned, this is my favorite book of the series, but like always, it couldn't be as good as it is without the books that came before it. I've talked about this especially in relation to the Leoness trilogy by Jack Vance, where book 3, Madook, is my favorite of the series, or with Lord of the Rings, where Return of the King is my favorite of the series. But without what came before, that last part of the story couldn't be as impactful and as good as it is. And that's the same thing with this one, although this is not the last book in the series. So that is my review for Sons of the Oak by David Farland. Thank you guys for watching an Erudite adventure. We post videos every Monday and Thursday, and our social media is linked in the description down below. We'll see you guys again soon. Stay warm.